So I'd like to give a very big welcome from Denby Dale Amateur Radio Club to all our members and visitors at tonight's meeting. Everyone is always welcome at my meeting, whether they're members or not, although I think the majority of people in the meeting room tonight are members of the club, but those that are visiting are more than welcome to come back as often as you like, and you don't have to pay us a penny. Our meetings are open for all amateurs that are interested in what we're up to, and of course afterwards we will post this film up onto our what is now very extensive YouTube channel of meetings that we've held since the beginning of lockdown a couple of years ago. It seems like a century ago, but just 2 years. So a big welcome to everybody. I'd like to introduce the subject tonight, which is a subject which might seem a bit strange for a radio club, but an introduction to the HF bands for beginners in amateur radio. And let me just say 2 words about that. First of all, I know in this meeting room, we've got people that are relatively new to the hobby. We've got at least one member who's managed to do 2 of our licensed classes since the beginning of lockdown a couple of years ago. So we've got new starters to amateur radio in the room here tonight. And we've also got a couple of people I know who have got back into the hobby after many, many years apart from it, who were into the hobby when they were in their teens or early 20s, and for one reason or another gave up the hobby and have now retired from work and thought, actually, I'm still quite interested in this radio stuff, and have dusted off their licenses, but have then discovered that things like HF radio is now completely different from what I remembered it was like 40 or 50 years ago. So they're classing themselves as beginners to radio. But a big welcome to everyone at tonight's meeting. And even for those of us in the room here tonight who have been radio amateurs for a very, very long time, I would say, like all hobbies, all of us are learning all the time. And I can't think of a single meeting that I've ever been to on any subject that we've had in the radio club, or a meeting I've been to involved with amateur radio, where I haven't learned something that I didn't know about, that I've gone along and I've found things out that I just never knew, and either from the speakers or from the discussion afterwards. So we're all beginners really in this journey of amateur radio. So without further ado, Anthony K8ZT and Dennis W6DQ from various parts of the US, the microphone and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Anthony Luscre, K8ZT.
And I'm Dennis Kidder, W6DQ.
Tonight is our UK version of a talk we did for the Rat Pack this last month during October. Here's my contact information, k8zt@awrl.net, and I have a website, k8zt.com. This is me in my trainman's uniform. I volunteer for a scenic railroad in the area.
And that's me with my contact information, collinsuser@yahoo.com or w6dq@awrl.net. If you want to see a little biography on my amateur radio escapades, you can check me out on QRZ. There's some great pictures on there of my Radio Shack and the things that I do. I do not have a website yet, so it's in holding. So Anthony, you got me there.
So we have a shortcut link for the presentation tonight, tiny.cc/UKBGHF, so UK Beginners HF, and you can also download a PDF from this. The slideshow is live, Google Slides, and we'll be updating the week 2 and 3. So if you take a look at it now, you're going to see some changes over time on those 2 weeks. So we're going to really talk about 3 different things over the course of the next 3 presentations. For this presentation, we're going to cover the HF bands operating and making contacts. In our second month, on December 14th, we'll be doing equipment and antennas. And on our 3rd session, February 1st, we'll be putting it all together, and we'll be talking about some other activities for HF. So we're going to divide things up today, and I will jump in first here, and then Dennis will jump in at different slides. So Many of us got into ham radio for the lure of talking with hams in far away and exotic sounding places around the world. I know one of the reasons I got into amateur radio was my love of geography, and I just thought I'm never going to have enough money to visit all these places, but ham radio is a way that I can go there virtually. So to do this magic directly without wires, satellite, or the internet, using radio, we need to depend on the HF or high frequency radio bands, which have worldwide propagation. Today's talk, we're going to be covering the HF bands. We're also going to be covering what's referred to as the medium frequency and low frequency bands. So basically, HF is 3 to 30 megahertz, also 80 to 10 meters if you want to describe it with meters. And we'll be also covering that lower section, the low frequency and medium frequency of about 0.3 to 3 megahertz, where 160 and 180 live. These are also known as shortwave bands. For our purposes, we'll be combining HF, medium frequency, along with low frequency and very low frequency for our discussion of amateur radio operations. We're going to cover basically 12 bands from 136 kilohertz all the way up to 29.7 megahertz. 6 of the bands I'm going to describe as traditional bands. These are bands that have historically been used for amateur radio. Some are a little bit newer than others, but most of these bands have been around for quite a while, and that includes 160, 80 meters, 40, 20, 15, and 10. There's also 3 bands that are the result of the late 1970s World Administrative Radio Conference edition of a few bands, 30 meters, 17, and 12. And then I'm also going to classify the rest of the bands as post-work bands, 60 meters, which is the only channelized band that we have allocations on as amateur radio operators, and the very low and low frequency bands. And I'm not sure exactly what the status of these 2 bands are in the UK right now. We've just been given access to these in the US in the last 5 years. That's the 2200 and 630 meter bands. So the bands are listed on this chart from the IARU for Region 1. And you'll see that Dennis and I had to do a little bit of work to come up with the right set of frequencies because our frequency allocations are slightly different. But I do have a document I want to share with you. And I also want to point out anywhere in the slideshow you see this different font or this little symbol. That means there's a link there to an outside resource. So when you click on that, it'll take you out to the resource. And in this case, the resource is a whole presentation on amateur radio charts and maps, including band privileges for a number of different from a number of different sources, band maps such as CQ zones, things from manufacturers on band segments, DXCC maps, map of Europe with all the grid zones, US ARRL, and districts and states, even the Canadian districts and provinces and their sections, and a number of different things. FM simplex frequencies, of course, that's the US version, but there's a whole variety, and including some software programs that'll let you print out an azimuth map from your location. The RSGB plans, the Region 1 band plan are all here, and you can click on these in that resource. There's also the written text version from the RSGB that I have a link to, and this lets you go into each of the bands. So when you go into HF section, of course, you can go through each of these and read the description. Okay, Dennis.
Okay. So this is something, like Anthony said, had to do a little bit of research on this. We're governed by the Federal Communications Commission here in the United States, Region 2, with the IARU. And IARU, of course, is the International Amateur Radio Union. But you are regulated by Ofcom, your telecommunications organization there, their commission, I guess I should call it. And the frequency allocations, they determine the frequency allocations and the modes that you can operate by your license level. And in addition to those allocations, there are some other bands like the work bands, for instance, the World Amateur Radio, what was that, World Amateur Radio Convention, where they allocated some new bands that we talk about. They have some other restrictions besides what we have by our license level and modes and what have you, that are based on power restrictions, mode restrictions, and things like the fact that we're not a primary user of that particular piece of spectrum. We're a secondary user, so there's restrictions placed by that. Aside from the regulatory side of everything, we have what we call gentlemen's agreements, where over the years of amateur radio, 100 and some odd plus years that we've been doing this, we've generally settled on agreements amongst ourselves as amateurs to only use certain bands for certain operations, to do certain types of functions within certain segments of the spectrum allocation. And so things like the RSGB field day, similar to the ARRL's field day, they only take place on the traditional bands that Anthony mentioned earlier. So we don't do contesting on the WARC bands, for instance. So they're held aside for that, which is, if you're not into contesting and it's a busy weekend, the WARC bands are a great place to go hang out. And so there's a lot of 5-band awards, like 5-band DXCC is a good example, that are from the 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10 meters. So those are the idea of the gentleman's agreements, where we restrict ourselves to what we do on particular segments. So worldwide, I mentioned the IARU, but ITU, actually the International Telecommunications Union, really does a lot of the assignments of spectrum throughout the world in what they call the ITU regions. The 3 regions are depicted there. And in particular, 40 meters is interesting because depending on which region you're in, you're restricted on what you can actually operate within that region, on what frequencies on 40 meters. For instance, in region 2, where we are, we actually have access to that segment from 7.2 to 7.3 megahertz. And of course, we have to put up with international broadcasters that are out there. So we're somewhat limited to what we can do there during the day, or on 40 meters, sorry. So region 1 has that restriction of no access to 7.2 to 7.3. So this is where the allocations differ depending on region. And I think you have a link there for that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I do.
Spectrum chart. I think you've had that up before.
Well, this is actually the big wordy chart that comes out.
Yeah.
Yes, this is the one that's all the descriptions that which the national rules are based on it.
Right. Yeah, that's the IARU, and is that IARU or ITU? I didn't catch.
That was the IARU.
It is IARU. So
yes,
that's self-governance through the amateur radio community,
yes,
rather than being regulated by our governments. Okay. So these gentlemen agreements, in addition to the restricting certain modes just for specific frequency ranges, we have what we call within these agreements, things we call band plans. And Anthony has linked us to what's called the Considered Operators Frequency Guide. And over the years, we have, amongst ourselves, decided to do certain activities within certain pieces of a particular piece of spectrum. So for instance, a good example I could use off the top of my head, was talk about the phone segment on 20 meters. A portion of the phone segment through gentleman's agreement is set aside for slow scan TV, for instance. And that's typically, if you're interested in slow scan, that's the frequency you go to look for somebody on slow scan. The same thing with if you're into digital and you're running FT8, there's a certain portion of the spectrum through agreement, gentleman's agreement, that is allocated to running FT8 or FT4. So likewise for things like teletype, the digital modes. Of course, those are allowed by regulation through a much broader range, but we tend to be the gentleman's agreements. The considered operator tends to restrict the operation to those agreed to frequencies and chunks of spectrum.
And this is where I insert the warning for everyone. Please avoid transmitting on beacon frequencies. So you'll notice that on 14 meters and up, there are beacon frequencies listed on here at 14.10, 18.110, etc.
Yeah, you talk about the beacons in another
Yes.
presentation. Those are great assets, great tools to use for checking on propagation. The beacons that were these IBP and Northern California DX Foundation beacons are throughout the world, and they're on a set schedule when they transmit, and they change their power levels. So they start out at a higher power and gradually drop down to a lower power. And if you know the time, you can determine which beacon is actually transmitting and figure it out if you can actually hear that beacon on that particular frequency. So they're a really amazing tool to use. There's plenty of other tools, but that's one that's really great. So RSGB band plan, this is published by your radio society. This is your band plan based on that, on the gentleman's agreement as to how those frequencies are allocated within the spectrum that's allocated to you by Ofcom and the IARU and ITU. So how we use those frequencies is what is determined here through those gentleman agreements. So this is a good document, and he has a link there if you're not familiar with that chart.
Just click on the chart, and it actually takes you out to the chart.
And the link that's on the page there takes you to that other page that has all the other charts and for all the other bands, other countries, sorry. So it would have the frequency allocations for the United States and Canada and what have you. So that is a great link. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I'm going to go ahead and switch over. I'm going to talk about each of the bands, and I'm going to group them. I'm going to first talk about what I'm going to refer to as the atypical HF ham bands. Not that they're strange or anything, they're just slightly different characteristics, and we're going to see that all the bands have their own characteristics. But 10 meters, I'm going to point out first, because its characteristics are very similar to the band that it's proximal to, and that's VHF. A lot of the things on 10 meters act very similar to VHF, so a lot of cases the propagation requires a very high solar activity, but it also can have sporadic E-skip, just as 6 meters can. It's the only HF band in the US where technician class licensees are able to operate. In the US, of course, we limit our starters, not like the foundation license, but we use the technician class license, and it prevents use of certain bands. So we're very restrictive in the bands as opposed to the power limitation for the foundation license. It's also the only HF band with FM allocation on it. So the only HF band with repeaters on it. And its proximity to the 11 meter CB service means equipment and antenna products cross over both ways, sometimes illegally, people utilizing amateur radio equipment on 11 meters and so forth. Just a word for everyone, if you're not realizing it, we're climbing up the sunspot. We're escalating the sunspot numbers, and 10 meters has been wide open recently. So if you haven't been on 10, try it out. Here's a little chart. This chart actually shows earlier in the year, but we've continued up the climb here, and we're in prime 10 meter and 12 meter time. 30 and 60 meters are also a little bit atypical in that they're shared allocations with other non-amateur radio services. In the US and in UK also, 30 meters is limited to CW and data with no voice privileges. So it's one of the few bands with no voice privileges on it. 60 meters is a channelized band, which is atypical for our HF bands. And in the US, our power limits are slightly different on those bands. I think yours are slightly different also. I don't know that for sure, but I know we have to use ERP measurement on the one. So if we're running 100 watts, once we run a gain antenna, we'd be exceeding that. So whenever you're looking at ERP, you have to remember that the antenna gain plays a role in that. And I have a link here to the RSGB's 60 meter 5 megahertz operating recommended practices. The other atypical bands are the very low bands, low frequency bands, the medium frequency and low frequency and very low frequency of 160, 630, and 2,200 meters. Resident antennas are very long on these bands, much longer than most other HF bands. This often discourages many potential operators. 160 has fairly recently been added to most HF radios. I'd say the last 20 years it's been around, but before that, a lot of radios started at 80 meters. And if you do want to operate 60, 630 or 2,200 meters, you need to either have transverters or other things because the radios are not in, those bands are not included on a typical HF radio. Propagation on these bands is highly influenced by the D layer absorption. So these bands are much better at nighttime when the absorption of the D layer is drastically decreased because of lack of ionization from the sun. They also exhibit gray line phenomena with enhanced propagation along the day-night line, and they are also very susceptible to atmospheric noise. I have a number of links in here about the bands, so you can go through each of these. This is a general guide to each of the bands. The last one on here is a playlist, and this gentleman goes through each of the bands with YouTube videos for each and every band. So you can go through any of the bands by going to the side here, choosing the band you want to get information on. He talks about it. So these are all other resources for you to use for more information on the bands. Now, one of the things about ham radio that we're really lucky, because we have such a wide range of frequencies, the characteristics of individual bands vary considerably. This allows us to pick a band based on where we want to talk in the world. Different bands will cover different distance ranges at different times of the day. This variation allows us to pick a band for local communication, such as 80 meters during the day, or pick a band for worldwide communication during the day, such as 20 meters and up. So we have the activity of absorption in the D layer and the reflection or refraction of the ionized F layer that accomplish this. So these are also based on solar activity. So there is quite a bit of variation in the distance for each band. As you will learn, each of the HF bands has a slightly to drastically different personality. They're somewhat like a group of people, but they also are like people in the fact that they have different moods depending on the time of day, season of the year, point in the sunspot cycle, geomagnetic activity, and other factors that affect them. So each band will be different at different times. Now, one of the biggest differences between HF and VHF contacts is the way the propagation takes effect. Most of the time on VHF, our propagation is basically line of sight. There are some activities such as tropospheric ducting that could extend that, but for the most part, a typical VHF contact is limited to a fairly short distance line of sight. Whereas on HF, it's about the propagation, and the ionization of the F layer and the absorption of the D layer allows signals to bounce around the world. Propagation between the stations is dependent on absorption and attenuation through the D layer, reflection and refraction of signals back to Earth by the ionized F layer, and in some cases, on the higher frequencies, by ionization and reflection of the E layer. Multiple skips of atmosphere and Earth reflection refraction occur, allowing signals to continue to travel around the world. And there's a really good article here from Carl, K9LA. Actually, it's a presentation he did for the Rat Pack group. It's a video you can watch on the current status of Sunspot Cycle 25 and interpreting the numbers in it. Make sure I didn't. Okay, let's see here. The analogy I sort of use is VHF is like archery and HF is more like fishing. With VHF, with the line of sight nature, if your signal's strong enough and you have the station within line of sight distance, it's pretty much like archery. You just pull back and shoot and you'll hit your target. Maybe not in the center, but you will be able to get the target. With HF, of course, it's a lot more like fishing. You send your signal out into the ether and hope someone's going to come back, depending on the propagation to that specific area. So that's my little analogy for that. And here's a little chart that just talks about the differences. On HF, we can have local communication to worldwide communication, whereas we're limited to line of sight on VHF. Distance on HF is dependent on the band and time of day. On VHF, we can extend our distance through the use of repeaters. On HF, dependence on sunspot and geomagnetic activities. On VHF, we can get some phenomena that are involved with the atmosphere, such as E-skip on 6 meters, tropospheric ducting, EME, etc., are ways to enhance propagation beyond the line of sight on VHF. Repeaters on HF are limited to 10 meters only. Most of the contacts are simplex, whereas repeaters are very common on VHF and UHF, including the newer DMR, D-Star, etc. repeaters. Popular modes on HF include single sideband, CW, and FT8 are probably the 3 most popular modes right now. On VHF, FM dominates with a smaller amount of single sideband, FT8, and CW for longer distance contacts and some contesting. Typical radios on HF, 100 watt, multi-band, multi-mode, CW single sideband digital, 160 through 6 meter radio is very common. On VHF, we have really 2 types of things, handhelds or mobiles or bases. They're typically FM only. They may be single or dual band, with 144 megahertz being the most common. Okay, Dennis.
All right, we'll segue into the modes that you started to talk about. So the modes that are used on HF, predominantly voice, single sideband, occasionally AM, and on 10 meters, there's a restriction to the only HF band that's allowed to operate FM. So at least within the United States, that's one thing I'm not sure about. If Ofcom regulations in Great Britain, how that's actually allocated for 10 meters, if there's an FM allocation there, I don't know. But CW again is available on all bands other than 10 meters. It's the only HF allocation for technician class, and technician class being the entry-level license here in the United States. So we do get technician classes, which are typically the VHF and UHF operation. They do get some access to some of the HF bands to operate CW, but that's it. That's all they get to do. And of course, digital modes, traditional digital modes like radio teletype, RIDI, and PSK, those are still out there. People still operate both modes. PSK 31, radio teletype. We just had a JARL just sponsored a teletype contest here a couple of weekends ago. But the newer modes, again, these are considered digital modes using digital sound card modes like FT8, FT4, and there's many, many others like Whisper and things like that. These are really great opportunities using things like FT8 for somebody new to HF, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on too. Image modes like slow scan television, that's another one that's allocated to one of the modes that we use on HF. And there's many, many other modes along those same lines, image modes and digital modes, but beyond our scope right now. So sideband, single sideband, or sideband as we call it, is primary mode of voice communications on HF since the 60s, and it replaced most AM activity. There's still a lot of, actually there is quite a bit of AM activity still. That's one of the things that I do. I do AM on 75 meters. And interestingly, there's a lot of AM activity on 10 meters, and a lot of it is when the band openings, we'll do a lot of DX on AM, which is kind of interesting to see that. And as stated here, if you're not tuned in quite exactly on sideband, you sound like Donald Duck, right? That's the problem with that. So it takes a little practice to be able to tune in a single sideband signal, but once you've got the hang of it, it's really simple. FM is only allowed. Now, again, I'm not sure in Britain if that's the case or not. Here, FM is only allowed in a portion on 10 meters. So that's a little different, but like Anthony says here, AM is still found typically at the upper end of 75 meters. Really the upper end of 40 meters, there's a lot of AM activity. And on 75 meters, we actually have what we call the AM window that's down in the middle of the phone band here in the States. And that's 3870 to 3890. So that's our AM window, and we have a lot of activity there. Digital voice is still an experimental thing, free digital voice, free DV. There will actually be a Rat Pack presentation later
Tonight.
today, tomorrow your time, later for us here on digital voice and free DV. So that'll be an interesting talk. And of course, if you can't attend in person, it is recorded. So you can always check out the recording when it's posted within the next couple of days. Okay, other modes, CW, continuous wave, Morse code, right? If you're interested in getting involved on CW, and I gotta say, it's a lot of fun to do CW. Anthony's got a presentation link there. Having fun with Morse is something you can check out. It's worth taking the time to look at that. And there's a lot of opportunities online if you are interested in learning Morse code and operating CW. There's a couple of organizations that will, and I think those are in your presentation there, if I'm not mistaken, Anthony.
Yes,
Long
yeah.
Island CW Club and the CW or Morse Academy, these kinds of things are great for learning how to do Morse code on the internet. So digital modes, we mentioned FT4 and FT8. Again, Anthony's got a presentation there that's listed there with the link on FT8 and FT4. But like we say, there's so many other digital modes and some really oddball ones too. But these are the primary ones that you'll run into. WinLink is an interesting one. That's taken off here in the States as a tool for emergency communications, and primarily, it started with a lot of maritime applications for getting email at sea. But this has become a real powerful tool for emergency communications because of the fact that we digitally send forms. So large amounts of data, tabular data, whatever, that doing that by voice or by using CW is very involved. Doing it digitally, we can just take an image and just send the image or just send the text directly in a form. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful tool. VAR-AC we use VARA, which is our RF modem software for WinLink. VAR-AC is a variation on using VARA, where you can do, it's like keyboard to keyboard text messaging. So that's a little different too. So it's kind of like a callback to the old days of radio teletype. So that's kind of fun. So yeah, check out those presentations. So here's the breakdown of HF privileges for your 3 license classes in the UK. And it's a little different than what we have here in the States. Your foundation, intermediate, and full. Here in the States, we'd have the technician, which, as I said earlier, is primarily VHF, UHF, but with some allocations on CW only on the lower bands on 80, 40, and 15 meters. You have a foundation license actually gives you quite a bit of variety to be able to get onto HF, albeit at low power. But you could do a lot with low power on HF.
And I want to insert a short advertisement here. I operate all at 5 watts, and I've now done over 105,000 QSOs with 5 watts or less. So that 10 watts is excessive power.
Yeah, that's QRO for you. So the intermediate class, you get a little bit more privilege in terms of a little bit higher power. And of course, when you have the full license, you're allowed to run at legal limit power, which I believe is 400 watts in the UK. So, and of course, it talks about we talked about this earlier, primary and secondary allocations. This chart shows you which parts of the spectrum are primary allocations to the amateur service and which are secondary that we share with other services. Let's see. Oh, you don't have, does the UK have allocation in 60 meters?
Maybe they do, but it wasn't on this particular chart.
Yeah.
And it wasn't on this particular chart. Actually, I made this chart up by combining the charts that were separated on many different pages of the guidelines from Ofcom. I'm sorry, from RSGB.
I've never worked any DX on 60 meters, so I don't know what the allocation is there.
I can tell you what the allocations are. Yeah, originally there were spot frequencies. And at the moment, they've relaxed it a bit and they'll give you a little bit of leeway either side.
Interesting. Okay.
So yeah, what's available is 5.258 and then 5.5264, and that is for QRP, center of activity.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, got it.
Yeah, and then you've got quite a few more, not spot frequencies, but very close to. And you can run AM as well.
Yeah, I noticed that now that you can do AM. That's interesting. Yeah, here in the States, we are channelized, so we are limited to staying within that channel, which says we've got to be on this frequency if we're on voice on single sideband. But we operate CW and digital modes as well. So that's interesting. Okay.
That's how it used to. We used to be spot frequencies only, you know, and then
we share 60 meters with the military here in this country, and it makes for some interesting events that we have, like the what do they call it? It's an
crossband military.
Yeah, the crossband military exercises that we do. It's an interoperability exercise we can do with the U.S. military occasionally, which is kind of an interesting thing that we can actually exchange information with them.
Dennis, and here's your answer to the FM.
FM. There it is.
Yes.
You do have an FM allocation on 10 meters. Okay. Okay.
We also we like yourselves. You might at one time in this country, you may be called by a station that is not a radio ham.
Ah, okay.
Like they are military.
Military. Okay, that's so right. You have that same type of an operation there. Interesting. Okay.
Exactly.
Nice.
So what I did is I pulled these up from all the multiple pages. You can go to the link here to get the original document.
So okay. So then the other part of this is the allocation of call signs. This is one that I had to study this for a while, but I'm an old timer. I'm used to the G prefix, and so the M prefix has really thrown me over the last few years. But understand that that's a new call sign prefix. I'm not sure when that started. But the call sign allocations are determined by your class of license, the operating class. So this is all the information on that. And so I presume that they're no longer issuing G prefix licenses in the UK.
It is possible, actually. It is possible, actually, Dennis, to get as a new license holder a G license,
okay,
if it's available. So
okay.
There are obviously, as people pass away and become silent keys and the license is no longer in use, they do then become available, and people that are very nifty are able to download licenses which are available and then apply to Ofcom and say, I passed my exams, I would like to get a full license, and could I have, G5RV? And if that's free, then they become G5RV. There aren't many of them, but we have got one or two in our club here who have done.
Excellent. Okay, so it's kind of like our vanity license program here in the United States, where we petition the FCC for a particular call sign, and if it's available, we have the opportunity to receive that. Like myself, W60Q is a vanity call that I applied for some years ago, and I was fortunate enough to receive that license grant. It belonged to one of my mentors when I was first getting into ham radio in high school. One of my mentors, W60Q. So I was thrilled that I was able to get that. But so this is on choosing your ideal call sign. Yeah. So anyway,
and I put the link in the chat. That's a presentation I've done a number of times for different people.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Okay. So let's see. I'm trying to figure out where do I'm still going.
You're still up.
I'm still up for a ways here. Okay. So when you're operating on HF, like other bands, you have different types of contacts. You have a random contact, which one station calls CQ and someone answers, or not. Hopefully someone answers. But you also have the serial type contact where one station is making contacts with a series of other stations. So for instance, this would be like a DX station calling CQ with multiple stations replying in a pileup. And the DX station will work them one by one. On the serial type operating, they may stay on one frequency where they're calling and listening on the same frequency, single frequency, but they may run what they call split, where the DX station runs, he's calling on one frequency, but he's listening on a range of frequencies because there's so many stations calling him. And like he'll say, the station may say listening 5 or 10 up, meaning listening up 5 kilohertz, listening up 10 kilohertz. And on CW, he wouldn't say listening, he'd just say 5 up or 10 up on CW would be the same function of running split. And go ahead. So in contesting is another type of contact that you can make. And it's a station where you're trying to work as many other eligible stations as possible within a defined period of time. And a lot of times with the contest, there are multipliers. Multipliers meaning that your overall score is multiplied by the multiplier, such as a state or a province or counties or zones, prefixes, things like that are all multipliers. And again, in that type of contest operation, you've got stations that are calling CQ, which we call running the contest, or stations that are hunting and answering the CQers, search and pounce, as we call that. So you're not necessarily interested in being competitive in a contest, but you're having fun finding, like in a DX contest, like last week in CQ Worldwide, you might be doing search and pounce, looking for a new prefix, looking for a new DXCC entity or something. So you use that search and pounce mode to find those. Another kind of type of contact you might make is a roundtable. And I like this, an on-the-air gathering of 3 or more operators, like a group chat, like a chat room on the internet. So roundtables, we pass the mic on between the various operators. And of course, a net is another type of on-the-air gathering of amateur radio operators, but we'll talk a little bit more about both of those later on. We'll get into that in more detail. So pure chance, like Anthony said with phishing, you call CQ and you listen for a reply. Call CQ, tune around, listen for somebody calling you back, but you might just tune around and listen for someone calling CQ. And of course, you can increase your odds, just like phishing, by checking the solar and geomagnetic conditions or choosing a band based on time of day or season of the year. So for instance, right now, 20 meters, for us here, 20 meters would probably be a good band to be operating. I was looking at, I've got 15 meters up on the radio behind me, and there's a little bit of activity on 15 meters here right now, but I wouldn't expect that in your part of the world to be active on 15, but probably 160 would be a little early, but 80 and 75 and 40 meters would probably be very active right now in your part of the world. So time of day, very important. One way to improve your odds of making contacts is to check the spotting sites. So spotting sites are websites where people will, if they hear a station or they work a station, they'll note that on the spot. So that station you just worked will get a spot and people will be able to see that. And that's really helpful if you're trying to work DX. You can look for DX spots to find out who's active and where and what frequencies they're on. And you can also improve your odds by getting on the air during periods of high activity. For instance, weekends, there's a lot of activity at weekends. Again, choosing the time of day. I wouldn't get on 80 meters at noon unless I wanted to talk to one of my friends locally. But even then, that might be spotty. But time of day, specific bands. And again, time of the year, September to April in the Northern Hemisphere, right? That's gonna have specific characteristics, wintertime characteristics. So 40 and 80 are going to be very, very good bands during this time of the year right now in the Northern Hemisphere. High sunspot activity, we're cycle 25 and we're really climbing up on cycle 25. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of the shorter wavelength bands, 15 and 10 meters especially, are open. And at peak, they'll probably be open 24 hours a day, which is truly amazing when that happens. Look for scheduled events, like we mentioned nets, but look for special events and contests like Field Day. The last weekend's CQ Worldwide SSB contest. Those are all scheduled events that come around every year. Those are ways to improve your odds of making contacts, is getting involved in those things, because there's a lot of activity during those events. Go ahead. And again, improving your odds is the way to do that is understanding the procedure, the effective calling and answering styles. There's a procedure that you want to follow. Having a script or a structure of a typical QSO, and understand the timing of that. And you don't, QSOs tend to have a certain structure to them, where you'll start out, if you answer a CQ, you'll exchange your name and location and signal report, which is really nice to know. Those are the typical things that you'll start out with, and both stations will do that. Your QTH, where you're located. It's always nice to know where the other station is located. That's all part of the structure of a QSO, that script. The timing of that as well, timing as to when to call the other station if they're calling CQ, when to listen and when to talk is important. And especially know how to use your radio's features. Modern radios are very complicated a lot of times, and can be somewhat overwhelming. But if you're trying to work a split DX station, know how to set the transmit and receive frequencies differently on that radio, on your transceiver. So that's a good one. I like this. If you're new to HF, have a friend, have one of your amateur operators be with you, have him there with you, or her with you, coach you. It's nice to have a coach to help you out. Make sure that you're within your band mode and license allocation. That's an important piece. And make sure that your antenna tuner, if you have one, they're properly set for the frequency you've chosen, so you have the right antenna for the right frequency. And this is one that I could never stress enough. This is my golden rule. I have 3 golden rules in amateur radio, and that's it right there. Listen is number 1, listen is number 2, and listen is number 3. Listen to what others do. Listen to how others operate. Mimic the best operators. And that is such great sage advice right there. But listen is really important. Listening to what's going on, listening to the conditions on the band, listening who's there. Those things are great and always a good thing. Other tips for HF contacts on sideband, single sideband, you have to be on the right mode based on which band you're on. So for instance, between 10 and 20 meters, we operate on upper sideband. We also operate on upper sideband on 60 meters. That's another one to be aware of. But this is it's a gentleman's agreement. It's really convention. There's nothing that says you have to run SSB or upper sideband on 20 meters. It's just a convention. And if you find that you're not making contacts and everybody sounds really funny, it could be that you're on the wrong mode. You might be switched to lower sideband. But the same with 40 meters, 80, and well, actually 40, 75, and 160 meters, lower sideband is the normal there. So again, Anthony has linked to a book, which is a wonderful book. Ward Silver is an incredibly good author. This is published, one of the dummy series, as they call it, Ham Radio for Dummies. It's a great book to have in your library if you're getting started with this. It's a wonderful book. And there
are some websites, so even if you don't have the book, you can go out and read this article, for example, where he talks about how to tune in a single sideband radio signal.
Ward has been a speaker on Rat Pack at times as well, as we've had him as a guest speaker. So check out his. He's a great presenter and always has interesting stuff. His last talk was on grounding and bonding, if I recall correctly. So that's a good thing to check out. The other thing that's important when you're doing phone versus CW is the filters. Your bandpass filters. Make sure for sideband that it's set wide enough for a voice channel, a phone channel, or a phone bandpass. If you're listening to phone on a CW filter, it's not going to sound very good. You can, of course, listen to sideband or I'm sorry, listen to CW on a sideband filter. That's a great way to start listening around. You don't have to tune in quite so precisely, but a 200, like you say, 0.2 kilohertz, trying to tune in a CW signal with a 200 hertz filter takes some getting used to, and it takes a little trial and error. Narrow filters, but narrow filters are great if there's a lot of QRM, a lot of other stations. Using a narrow filter on CW, you'll get rid of all that other QRM and just hear the station you're after. So be attentive to the bandwidth on your radio. Stay in the band. This is important. Especially important if you run vintage gear like I have. I have a lot of radios here that are older than I am. And heaven knows I'm old enough, but what your frequency display tells you may not really be what's going on there. You can't necessarily trust the display on your radio, even new radios with digital displays. So we caution people to stay away from the band edges. So if you're on upper sideband, stay at least 3 kilohertz away from the top of the band allocation. For no other reason that if your signal's 3 kilohertz wide, and you happen to set your VFO right to the band edge, you're outside the band because you're transmitting 3 kilohertz outside the band with your audio. So staying below the top of the band is a good idea. Keep yourself within the band. So there's a good example, for 21.450, the top of the band for 15 meters for here in the States, 21.447 megahertz. You want to stay below that frequency. And likewise, on lower sideband, stay away from the bottom of the band allocation by 3 kilohertz or more. So now you've got general class on here, but on our allocation, our general class allocation 7175, we would want to operate at 7172 or above, because you don't want your lower sideband outside of the band allocation. And again, on CW, stay at least 500 hertz. Yeah, 500 hertz away from the band edges. This is a good practice to be in. Also, if your radio has what's called RIT or ZIT, or it's receiver incremental tuning or transmit incremental tuning, or a lot of times it's called a clarifier, make sure they're turned off when you do your initial tuning. What this allows you to do, if you're not familiar with RIT, after you tune a signal in, or after you start transmitting, if signal's a little bit, if you're on a transceiver, signal's a little off frequency that you're receiving, you can use the RIT to tune him in a little bit clearer without changing your transmit frequency. That's important, because if you're both off a little bit, if you retune, if you tune and you don't have this RIT or ZIT, for lack of another way to call it, I don't know what else to call that, transmit incremental tuning. If your radios are a little bit off from each other and you're tuning on one frequency and he's tuning on another frequency, when you start transmitting, he's going to retune. Well, when he starts transmitting, he's going to be off frequency from where you were before. So you're going to have to retune again. And so you'll be chasing each other around with your VFOs, something you really don't want to do. So RIT is a good thing to get used to using that. Now, Anthony's put together a table here of a lot of manufacturers of various radios, HF radios. And so he's got links to the manufacturers' websites, which is great. If you're into vintage radios like I am, if any of you collect vintage radios, BAMA, the Boat Anchor Manual Archive, is an incredible resource. So many of these manuals are unavailable, out of print. You don't have a manual for that radio that's 50 years old. The company's out of business. Where do you get a manual? Well, there's always eBay or some of the companies that make reproductions, but you can download a free copy of many, many manuals right here. So if you're into classic boat anchor radios, vintage gear, that's one to know and have that bookmarked. There's also Anthony's brought up a list of guides. I'm trying to think, where did I put that? Oh, there we are. I'm on the right page now. Trying to keep track of where I am here. Sorry. For some of the popular radios. So there's a series of books that are published for the various manufacturers, like I call the Yacom Wood, ICOM, Yaesu, and Kenwood radios. A lot of information online. A lot of guides to help you. Sometimes the manuals can be a little overwhelming if you're new to this. So the guides kind of step you through the manuals and help you out. So those are great resources, and Anthony's done a good job of listing a lot of those resources. So there are a lot of videos and things like that you can check out. So let's see, speak clearly. Oh yes, speak clearly. And again, have a local ham, somebody that's nearby, help you set your audio levels. In other words, listen to that signal, listen to your signal, and help you get the audio levels and the settings correct on your radio. This can be really helpful. Having somebody listening to your signal. One of the things I recommend is using one of the web SDRs. If you're not familiar with those, I know you've got some. Do you have that in? Yeah, that's.
I do have it coming up.
Yeah, it's coming up in the presentation. But I encourage the use of the web SDRs to monitor your own signal, to see, not only see what it looks like, but to hear what it sounds like. It's a great resource. Use those ITU NATO phonetics. This is especially when you're working DX, use the ITU phonetics. Not so much the carefully chosen alternatives for international operations for DX, but for ITU phonetics are great. Everybody should know the ITU phonetics, be familiar with them. Use that for your call sign, of course, Whiskey 6 Delta Quebec, and your name as well, so you can get that through on phone. Know the most widely used Q signs, the typical ones. And then here again is a link to the typical Q codes. Be familiar with the most commonly used ones, and especially ham jargon, and there's plenty of that out there. Be familiar with that. Don't overuse it, though. We recommend not overusing the jargon, but understand those typical parts of a QSO. I talked about that earlier, what the structure of the QSO is. Signal reports are one of the things that you would provide in a contact. And if you're not in a contest, try to be accurate. Give the other operator a real accurate signal report. What does the signal sound like? Is it clear? Is it distorted? Is the signal strong? Is it an S9 signal? Is it weak? Is it over S9, plus 20, plus 30 dB. These are all good things that the other operator would love to know about his signal, especially if there's distortion or some kind of a problem with the signal. So signal reports for non-contest operation, try to be as accurate as you can. In contests, typically it doesn't matter. 599 or 59 on phone, or 5NN, which is the contraction for 599. If the station can hear you, you're 599, right? That's the way it works. Speed and consistency are more important than the accuracy of a signal report in a contest. So 5NN or 59 on phone, there you go. Just be aware of that in a contest. Don't get into details. Making your first HF contact, Anthony's got a link here to a page that goes into that talks of details about it. Really good resource to check out. Read through that, and some really good a good script there to follow. Okay, Anthony, back over to you.
Well, we talked a lot about timing and saying the right things at the right time. I have a whole presentation on it called Get in the Rhythm, Know the Rhyme, and Dance the Dance that talks about things like this. And if you click on this link, you'll be able to go out and view the slideshow. There's also some recordings I've done of it. But things like this, getting into that busy power up by just the same way you would merge onto a highway. And the timing is everything, phonetics, knowing cue symbols, etc. So this is a lot of stuff on making successful exchanges. And here's a chart that a lot of people find useful in here somewhere coming up. Maybe not. It's not in this one. It's in another one. I'm sorry. But I have a chart called Did They Hear Me or Not? And it talks about just knowing whether the other station received you or not. That's another slideshow I'm going to show in a moment here. But that's one of the slideshows available. I also have another one that talks about setting up your radio and testing to make sure everything's working okay. And this also covers the reverse beacon networks, spotting networks, using software-defined radios for listening to your signal remotely, and a lot of other tools. And this was
Web
presented at the Rat Pack, and you can also go into the slideshow here. Dennis was referring to using online software to find radios, and I talk about it in this presentation. So let's see here. I think, okay. There are a number of both passive and active methods for hams to let other hams know about on-air activity. Dennis already mentioned listening to spy networks. There's really 3 different types out there. DX clusters for spotting. These are your general things where people post the information. The reverse beacon network, which is automated. It hears and decodes CW signals and posts the information without someone having to post it. And the PSK reporter, which does a similar thing for FT8, PSK, FT4, other digital modes like that. These are all things that you can use. As I mentioned, the reverse beacon network is for CW, and I have information on that, and also in that previous talk I talked about. And PSK reporter will let you go out and see where activity is. And one of the things that I tell people about PSK reporter, even if you don't use FT8, you can use it as a propagation tool as long as you know a ham in your area that's on regularly. You put their call sign in instead of yours because you don't operate FT8, and it will show you where that signal is being heard around the world. That doesn't mean they made a contact, but 83 minutes ago, you can see I was +1 dB in the Canary Islands. So it gives you an idea. So again, if you know someone that's active on FT8, you can just use their call sign to get a good indication of where the band's open. On single sideband, of course, we have to depend on people spotting the information manually because there's no automated way to do it. And that means that you won't see stations that aren't exciting or aren't something special being spotted for the most part. I have a whole web page of information on propagation and spotting information. Let's see here. I want to make sure I don't get into Dennis's section.
Oh, no, you're not there yet.
Okay, good. Okay. Reasons to get on during HF contest, even if you're not interested in being competitive. There's high activity level on most traditional bands. You can hone your copying skills by copying unfamiliar call signs and POW-ups, work new grids, states, counties, countries, etc. And one of the most important things, other stations want to work you as you're worth points for them. So it's remarkable how well my 5 watts sounds in a contest when the person wants the points as opposed to a casual conversation. Even technician or foundational licensees can join the fun. Other hams appreciate the context you provide. The important to know, if you want to get on during a contest, even if you're not going to be competitive, know the exchange that the other station expects from you. And I have a whole article on that, talks about different types of exchanges and where to find the information for that type of exchange. It allows you to evaluate your station's performance. It's a good way to experience and learn about propagation effects. And you choose how much time you want to spend in the contest. You can invest just a little bit of time, or you can go full-time butt in share and try and work for a top score. You can send in your log or not, it's your choice. Don't worry if you work someone in a contest and you don't send your log in, they will not get dinged points for not having you send your log in. I did a presentation for the Rat Pack group. You can watch the recording, go to the slideshow. It's an introduction to amateur radio contesting if you're not that familiar with contesting. There is also a class that I did for the ARRL. It does require membership, but there is a free trial available, so you can go take the class and get the suitable for leather binding PDF that I wrote. Dennis?
Okay. So we've talked about some of these activities that we can get involved in HF. Of course, contesting that Anthony was just talking about, but also awards chasing, like county hunting. Like if you know, an interesting thing here that is sponsored here in the States is the County Hunters Award. So you get awards by working counties, and it's incrementally. I can't remember what the entry level is, but you incrementally move up in classifications of the county hunters, like worked all states. Of course, other activities, DX especially, most hams are into DXing. We have the DX Century Club that's sponsored by the ARRL, for instance, and great opportunities to talk as where this presentation started, and being able to talk around the world. We'll talk about nets in the upcoming slides, but some other activities, POTA and SOTA. POTA is something that the ARRL sponsored here a couple of years ago called Parks on the Air. And POTA has to do with our national park system here in the States, putting national parks, activating national parks. And I think you were doing some of that, Anthony, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I do. I've lived very close to a park, and I do that quite often.
Yeah, so
and SOTA, of course, is started in the UK.
Yeah, Summits on the Air, which is great. And I've got a couple of my friends here in where we live that are really, really active on SOTA. So this is Summits on the Air. Of course, many of us like to operate portable. I know Anthony likes to operate portable all the time, portable QRP, but portable operation, you know, Field Day is a good example of portable operation. But a lot of us operate mobile. Mobile is a great opportunity. I run an HF station mobile. I've done that for quite a few years, run a mobile station in my vehicle. Some of the other activities, construction and building, if you like making things, designing and building antennas is a great thing to get involved in. And of course, home brewing and building kits. There's still lots and lots of kits out there that you can build, but home brewing, especially if you like to build your own gear, build your own kit, right? Fantastic opportunities there for HF to be able to build things. Amplifiers, for example, an LD MOS amplifier, solid state amplifier would be a good construction project. Emergency communications. I mentioned that earlier. Most of the emergency communications that we do is local, because emergencies tend to be a local thing. So they're usually heavily involved in VHF and UHF communications, but in a regional sense, HF becomes a very important tool for emergency communications. Hurricanes, like we recently had here in Florida, is a good example. Hurricanes like Puerto Rico, HF becomes a very vital tool for emergency communications in that type of a scenario. And along, kind of hand in hand, along with emergency communications, is handling traffic, message handling, right? That's traffic. Being able to accurately and correctly, quickly pass a message from one station to another. So that's another thing to get involved in. Today we have something called RRI, Radio Relay International, which is an international network of amateur radio operators that do nothing but handle traffic. And some of them do it on CW, some of them do it on phone, others do it using WinLink and other digital modes. So that's another great activity to get involved in. Special modes. I don't know what you were actually referring to with special modes. What are we talking about there? Things like slow scan and
things like slow scan.
Slow scan. Okay, yeah. So slow scan television is kind of a neat thing. It's been around for a long time, where you actually can send a still image, a photograph, on HF through an audio of a voice bandwidth 3 kilohertz channel, which is pretty cool. So that's a special mode. And of course, if you're like me and collect over the top with classic and boat anchor radios, that's another great activity. I have a building full of them here. So, I love the old radios and the stuff that I grew up with. So it's great. So the other activity we alluded to, nets. Nets are important. And it's like we said, it's like an on-the-air chat room, right? This is an on-the-air gathering. Most of these nets follow a schedule. They have a specific schedule they follow, and they meet on a specific frequency. And they're organized to be there for a purpose. It may be, like I said earlier, the traffic handling. It may be relaying messages. It could be a award chasing, like county hunters mentioned that. Some common topic of interest, weather, emergencies, special modes, boat anchors. We've got a bunch of boat anchor nets that I participate in. And I mentioned AM. We have AM nets that meet regularly, weekly. They can be directed or undirected. And what does this mean? A directed net. See, I think you don't really go into that in here. So directed net means there's one operator who's in charge, and he's like the traffic cop. And so he or she directs the net. And basically, everybody checks into the net, and they get called in turn by the net control station, the director of the net. In an undirected net, it's, for lack of a better expression, free for all. But like a round table is a good example of an undirected net, where everybody takes their turn and just passes the mic on to the next operator, and it just goes around in a round table as it's described. Lots of resources for nets online. Lots of there's YouTube information on YouTube. There's net lists that's listed here, lists after lists of HF nets. Directory search, the net directory search that covers all HF, VHF, and UHF nets. And I'm not sure if ARRL's that net list may not be international. I'm not sure about that. I don't.
Yeah, I made sure I got one from the.
There you go. Okay. And there's, I think if you just do a Google search for HF nets, you'll find lots of information that may not be listed here, but these are some good resources. I mentioned the roundtable is on the air gathering 3 or more. Yeah, you're not going to have a roundtable with 2 people, but with 3 operators, you can have a roundtable, and there's no net control. You just take turns talking. And because of changing propagation, it can be difficult. If you're used to operating on a repeater, there's no beep, there's no courtesy tone when you stop talking. So on single sideband, you have to be kind of attentive to what's going on so that you don't double or talk on top of each other. Typically, when the operator speaking will hand the mic off to the next operator, let him know. So like you said, there's no visual cues. When we're talking with friends, we know when to talk and when not to talk. If we're in person, right? Or if we're here on Zoom, we know when to talk and when not to talk. But on the radio, you can't see the other guy, so you don't know when to talk.
And you can't shake your head yes either.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Absolutely. Okay, so let's see, awards. These are the major awards that are out there. It's a great list. Worked All States. These are Worked All States is an ARRL award. Worked All Continents. DXCC, DX Century Club is working DX entities starting with 100 and working your way up. Worked All Zones, which is sponsored by CQ Magazine, the CQ DX zones. And again, the worked prefixes, WPX, that's another award. You've got the VA3RG world list, which is quite good. Awards from many, many countries throughout the world. If you're interested in those, that's a great resource. If you're into chasing awards, there you go. US list, US awards. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are great resources. I think so that's it.
That's me now. If you're just getting started, these are 4 presentations I've done over the last couple of years. One on buying amateur radio equipment. I already mentioned the successful operating. I also did a UK version of my technician one. It's a ham radio life beyond repeaters. It was originally designed for US technicians, but it applies to anyone who's basically wants to move beyond just using VHF repeaters. So that's the end of the session. This is the link again, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, brilliant, Anthony and Dennis, for a fantastic introduction. And looking at all that stuff, and of course, there was so much in your presentation that you gave us there. And this is part 1 of your 3-part guide for beginners. It just shows you all the different things we do in our hobby that we don't even realize, do we? And what there is there to find out about. So thank you, guys. Can I go over to our audience and see who would like to ask a question or chip in with a comment? Everyone's welcome. So who wants to go first? Now you're all going to go quiet on me, aren't you?
We like to say it's like drinking from a fire hose, right?
And don't blame Dennis for any of the slides. We cooperated on it, but I forced the deck down his throat to start with, and then we tweaked it.
Yeah, it's okay. It's good. This has been a lot of fun. I enjoy doing this with Anthony. Anthony does a great job, and it's been a lot of fun doing this.
Can I pass the microphone over to Ian and Brian and Gerald down in Huddersfield in the Hadawi Centre? How did it come across to you, and do any of you have any comments to make? So microphone in your direction, Ian.
Yeah, well, I presume you can hear us. I'll kick off and say, Anthony and Dennis, absolutely fantastic. The depth in the stuff is fantastic. I will be going through the slides and steering in various different directions to suit me and CW. And having sat here with Gerald and Brian, we've been chatting about various different avenues. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for what you've done. It's in depth, and I think a lot of people will get a lot out of it.
Good.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Can I just come in and say as well, thank you. It was absolutely terrific. I was one of the persons who's taught the radio amateur classes for many years. I thought I knew a little bit about it, and you've brought out some new ideas I never thought of putting in. I want to try to include them if we do another one. But it really was interesting. I can't wait to download it onto my computer at home and go through it all again, because half of it's gone already.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
No, I think all's been said, really. We all tend to drift on to the things that we like to do. And there are so many things within amateur radio to do that it's a good job. Everybody doesn't want to do the same thing. Now, I personally, I am involved with the Worked All Britain group. Now, the Worked All Britain group is an organisation that is an award organisation, and we collect the 10 kilometre squares throughout Great Britain, and there are over 3,000 of those. And there's lots of information on the website if you want to look at that. Worked All Britain, you'll find it. And they've run all sorts of awards, all based around the Ordnance Survey mapping system. They run nets, no particular time, 7160 now on 40 meters, and 3760 on 80 meters. There's also a top band one. I'm afraid I can't get onto top band. I don't have room for antennas, unfortunately, but there we go. But it's, it's a scheme that I'm involved with. I have done DXCC. I've managed the 100 for there, and I've done Islands on the Air and various other things. But there are all sorts of things that I haven't done that I still really ought to have a try. And I'm getting a bit old in the tooth, so whether I'm going to get round to it all or not, I don't know. But thanks very much. That's it's been super, and yeah, it makes you see. In fact, if anybody new has been watching tonight, they'll be absolutely bewildered as to what there is there, and they'll have to start sorting themselves out to see what they like. And there we go. Thanks a lot.
Wonderfully said. Thank you.
I just popped a link in there. I did a presentation on portable and field operations that would be might be useful for some of you, so I put a link in there for that. And by attending our session today, you're required to investigate all the links that we've included in the slides. So.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Just
to say to Dennis and Anthony, we had a presentation a few weeks ago from one of our club members, Tom ZT1T, down in South Africa, who talked about HF beacons. And when I started off in amateur radio, HF beacons was the way to find out whether the bands were open and where propagation was coming from. But over the years, it slightly slipped out, and Tom's presentation to the club a few months ago, I think, opened a few eyes to a number of us to remind us that they are there and they are useful. This is my tuppence halfpenny for for newcomers to radio, particularly those that have had a crack at CW. And of course, with modern radios, you can program the radio to send CQ and put your call sign in, even if your CW is very lousy. I really do enthuse about the reverse beacon network. And the reason I enthuse about it is that, you know, you can set all your equipment up and you can call CQ and you've got no idea whether your transmission's getting out and who it's getting to. And what the reverse beacon network does is when you're sending a CQ in CW at any speed on any of the bands, is that you see a little screen pops up to show exactly where you were. And when I just wanted to show people that have never used the reverse beacon network, while you mentioned it, Anthony, in your presentation.
Yes, in this one presentation, I go into it in great detail, this successful operating.
Well, what I was just going to show, Anthony, was when you started to speak about it, I very quickly, I'm just going to stop your screen sharing for a second.
I got it.
And share what I did. You were speaking, 15 minutes ago, and you mentioned reverse beacon network. So I very quickly on 40 and on 20 put out CQ. And you can see from the band map there, and you can see in more detail what was received, that, you know, my 20-meter signal got down there to Costa Rica, some 5,000 miles away, into the east coast of the States on 40 meters, across down into EY8ZE down in Turkmenistan on 40 meters. And you can see from the data here, so first of all, it's showing you who the call sign is that's picked you up. And then across the screen there, you've got what's called SNR, signal to noise ratio. So that is the size of the signal being received above the noise in those locations. So by W7ZI, for example, on 40 meters at plus 10 dB. And if you see a signal like that, you're thinking, well, actually, if I can be picked up on the East Coast in a signal strength more than 10 decibels, I'm one of you with a radio could possibly hear me, and we could make that contact. So I not only do I know my radio's working, I can see where the bands are open to me at any particular time. And so for those that have never tried it, I really recommend, just if you don't know where to find it, just Google reverse beacon network. The introduction will come up. It says to you, put your call sign in there, put it in, put out a CQ call, and then you'll get a little map come up on the screen exactly as I showed you just there. I'm a great enthusiast, Anthony, of the RBN, because I think it's, and you can do more. You can, the other thing, and I was talking to Ian about it, our club secretary earlier today. I spent a couple of hours on Monday or Tuesday morning looking at the differences in my transmission between two antennas, my off-center fed dipole and my vertical. And I compared it on about 3 different bands, both the aerials, within a couple of minutes of each other on slightly different frequencies, but very close frequencies. And I was able to compare station by station where I was being heard and what the signal strength was. And I was very surprised to see on Monday morning, I think it was, that on every single band and on with the 2 antennas, that my off-center fed dipole was performing better than the vertical, even with DX, which is quite surprising to me, even, because quite often the vertical outperforms a dipole on DX because of the lower angle of radiation of the transmission. But it is fabulous, isn't it, Anthony? You're showing some of it on the screen there, but I think it's something that is probably one of the most useful devices we've got for checking our radios are working and where you can get to.
Indeed.
So your little screen there, Anthony, with the links to various presentations, I think is something that definitely I would recommend people exploring if they've never tried it.
In this one link right here, which is not working right now, of course I got to fix it. This is from Dave Kessler, and he talks in here how to use the reverse beacon network if you're not a CW operator. He talks about step-by-step how to program it into your memory of your radio so that you can send what you need to trigger the reverse beacon network. And I have a whole section on reverse beacon network in here. For example, I just spit out 5 watts one day, and I saw that all the bands were open from my house on CW. So it's a great tool. You can also check it. I checked antennas with it also. It's a great way to do it. And that is in this presentation called Successful Operating Tools for Assessing Performance. I'll put this link in the chat. Let me do it this way. But that is it is a great way to do that. Okay, I'll stop the screen share.
Right. Has anyone else got questions, comments that they want to make in the audience here? Just shout. Who wants to say anything? You've all gone very quiet now. Yes, go on, Jeff, in Belgium.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Anthony and Dennis. This is really a wealth of information, and this is something which should be given to every course for starters of radio amateurs. I think it's very helpful. One question I have, and I don't know if you have any clue to that, I'm actually looking for a list of gray lines. I mean, if I, in Oscar November, wants to work VK2 in gray line, what would be the optimum date and time? I remember there was existing something on paper years ago, and I had that, but I lost that document. So I can assume that there is maybe a program or a document or a website where you can get that kind of information.
Yes, DX Atlas is one of the programs that has it built in, the ability to set the time and locations, and it'll show you the gray line.
Okay.
But there are other ones. I'd have to do a little bit of research to find them, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And I had that. Are you talking about the gray line predictor with the plastic slides that went in for the different seasons? I forget the name of it. I have one. I actually have one here somewhere in the shack, buried somewhere. But yes. But the other thing is, a lot of the logging programs today, when you put in the location, they'll tell you the sunrise sunset times for the other stations. But there are some programs that do the actual calculations for you, and I think DX Atlas, if I remember correctly, does do that. I'm not positive on that, but I know it does display the gray line for you.
Okay. My Elmer, when for United Nations, made a booklet years ago. I had that, but I lost it underway. I lost it.
There's the one we used to use.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. As a shortwave listener, I had that. Yeah. Yeah, great.
It's got all the different seasons, a stack of cards, one for each month. These are great.
Exactly. Yeah. I had that years ago, but I lost that.
And nowadays, the internet, like you say, there's a lot of sites, many sites that provide that information real time.
Yeah. It's real time. That's the problem. But I want to know the date in the future. Like I have some friends in VK2, and we are discussing we should do something on 40 meters. And what would be the optimum date and time to do that?
Optimum date and time.
That's more difficult to find, I think. Yeah, thank you very much for everything. Brilliant.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Jeff. Anyone else with a question or a comment? Yeah, Andrew, 2E0GYI. I know you won't mind me saying I know, but you started off in the hobby really at the start of COVID, didn't you? And worked your way through the license to the intermediate license now. I mean, can I just ask you a question? Did you find that presentation tonight of Anthony and Dennis's interesting and helpful to you? Does it given you a few ideas to go and explore?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I mean, like as you say, you know, I passed my foundation in 2020 and my intermediate in 2021. So I've only been licensed, you know, 2 years most, well, 18 months, whatever. And yeah, absolutely fascinating. You know, the links to follow for information, because that's the thing, as you say, it were all right passing an exam in lockdown, but it was getting the information, you know, to start in amateur radio. We're not being able to meet anybody and not being able to go to clubs and things. So that, you know, that any information has been very interesting for me, because it's very difficult when you first start out and you know nothing about it. I mean, I was a shortwave listener for 20 years, but you know, it's still a different thing when you're transmitting and you're entering these contests and things, and like you say, it's all a learning curve. But yeah, fascinating. You know, I'm going to copy the links and have a good scout through all the information. It's really interesting. Thank you very much.
I added 2 links for gray line information. There's one for MasterTurf, and then there's a commercial program. It's $25, but it's called DX Toolbox. It's a shortwave propagation tool. You might take a look at that. There's a demo version of it.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yeah, great. And what Andrew is telling actually is one of the things I sometimes you can find everything on the net. That's absolutely true. But the way you have put that to a meaningful and structured way, that's what we need actually. Because otherwise you just turning around on the internet and find probably all things which are not meaningful to our purposes. So that's a good demonstration, I think, of that idea.
My slideshows tend not to be slideshows, but references for later, because I do include a lot of links in them. And I think that's the important part. There's a lot of material out there that's good. So when I find a good resource, I make sure I keep track of it and include it in my presentations.
And it's very complete, I have to say. It's really complete.
Yes, Ian, you're waving at me.
Yeah, I'll come back. I'd like to thank Anthony, because when we had the FT8 talk, I had no interest in FT8.
Another convert.
Yeah, and I let it go. And actually, this isn't about FT8. This is more about the information that you passed on. That I went back, went to the slides, and learned afterwards that there was so much information within all of the talks and in the slides. So thank you. And to be part of a talk, and obviously I've seen tonight with Dennis is taking notes, this is something that continues to grow.
Oh yeah.
You know, I can see WAB mentioned, you're like, oh, WAB, right, okay, we'll add that one in as well. Quite splendid to be involved and of something as this and to be part of it. And obviously you get so much from what you do as well.
I want to share the Rat Pack group. I didn't do that. I want to do this real quick here. This is the Rat Pack organization, and it's not a club or anything. It's just a group that Dan K7REX put together, and we have these presentations all the time, and there's a list of them. As you can see on here, they are all recorded, and there's over 250 of them that we've done so far. Well, not there's over 240 we've done so far, and you can go back to any of these and watch the videos, download the documentation for them. As I said, Wednesday nights are typically general topics, and Thursday nights are generally emergency communication. So last week, Dennis and I finished up our beginner's guide, and then we had on Thursday night we had an update on the Florida hurricanes and the situation there. But upcoming sessions, we're going to have two on SOTA coming up, one on SOTA VHF and one on SOTA HF. So we have a variety of these. And as I said, they are at 1 Zulu, but that'll be changing to, I'm trying to remember now if it goes forward or backward. I think it goes to 2 Zulu that they're going to be changing to. But we always have the recordings available, or you can join us live. You're always welcome to join us. And you can go through this. There's different tabs on here. You can go through the different tabs and access them by topic or by speaker. I'll put the link for this in the chat. This is the link this is the best link to use. I'll put this in the chat.
Brilliant, really.
No, that didn't work. Let's try that one more time.
Yeah, Rat Pack has been a lot of fun for us, the group putting that together and our planning group. And this all came out of the pandemic, out of COVID. It started as a way for the section managers to be able to communicate over Zoom, and then with this our section emergency coordinator. So it started out as an emergency communications group, and it expanded out to what it is today, where it's all inclusive, just about any topic. And if there's a specific topic that someone wants to see, we encourage them to submit that information. There's a link to be able to submit topics for Rat Pack. So it's been a really incredible opportunity, and we have had worldwide participation, which is fantastic.
And we also have fun too. We have an annual April Fool's joke we put together, an April Fool's amateur radio topics. And then coming up in December, we'll be having our annual holiday gift guide. So we're all picking out our favorite things we think we want for the holidays, and we're including them as a group presentation. Dennis wants me to wear my my North Pole adventure conductor's uniform for it. So.
There you go. What do I want for Christmas? I want a Telrex Christmas tree. Oh, well.
Okay, anyone else before we let Dennis and Anthony go want to make a point or ask a question? If not, can I say thank you to both of you? Been really good evening, and as you say, particularly the links. So can we show our appreciation to Anthony and Dennis in the normal way? Well, thank you. And we'll be looking forward to part 2 of the presentation, and of course in the new year, part 3. So hopefully by then more people will do what Ian did on your FT8 talk, Anthony. Go back to the slides and then follow through some of the links and follow it through, and then follow how to set the radio up, and did it and got it working. And you know, that's the only way we find things, is by trying to do them, don't we? You know, if you've got decent presentations, then you're half the way there. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anthony and Dennis. It's been great.
Well, you're very welcome. I just have to warn you of one thing, though. As you go through the slideshow presentation, we haven't tweaked week 2 and 3 yet, so you may see some things that'll be changing on there, because we have to move from our electrical regulations to some of yours. So we'll wrangle that out. And it was really fun putting this together. It was fun going through the frequency allocations and things like that for me, because it was very enlightening.
What's interesting for that upcoming one, where we talk about British standards for electrical systems and what have you. I'm actually a little familiar with that from the work I did in Hong Kong. So is it BS 7671, if I recall correctly, is what it is. So we'll talk about that.
Before we get back together, please give me a contact on the CQ Worldwide on November 28th and 29th. I'll be on.
Well, what we'll do, Anthony, is we'll have a look out on the reverse beacon network for you.
Yeah.
There you go.
And we'll
I unfortunately I don't call CQ much with my 5 watts. I'm more of a 100 pouncer, but
yeah, I get that.
I had fun. I did work a number of people. I just feel really bad for M6 Tango. At the very end, we couldn't finish the contact in the last couple seconds. So I'm not sure exactly where he's at there, but I think he's on the west. I think he's on the East Coast, a little bit south of you. But
well, I definitely want to say thank you for inviting us to join you and make this presentation. This has been a lot of fun. And really, I've had a lot of fun doing this with Anthony, but I really enjoyed doing this with your club. This is fantastic. Look forward to next month.
Brilliant. Okay, and I mean, I think as we've said this before in the club, but you know, getting together radio amateurs, not just from our own country, but from other parts of the world, is fabulous. That's what makes amateur radio so exciting, that it's an international hobby, and we're all playing around in different countries, but with the same hobby, and exploring with each other the differences and learning new things. That's what makes this medium that we've discovered and used from the lockdown, you know, has been one of the positives, I think, of the last couple of years. Haven't been many positives, but it's definitely been one of them.
Definitely been one. Yes.
I have one thing I wanted to tell you real quick. Let me just double check to make sure it's correct. But I think the presentation I'm doing for the Norfolk group is going to be the successful operating one, if I remember correctly. So I'll be doing that for them on January 4th.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to hit the stop record button, but thank you, everybody. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it.
7-3, everyone.
73, all the best.